Hi, everyone. Good afternoon, and thanks for joining us for NDARC's webinar series this week. My name is Daisy Gibbs. I'm a PhD candidate at the National Drug and Alcohol Research Centre, and I am your chair today. I'd like to start off by showing my respects and acknowledging the traditional custodians of the land that I'm joining this webinar from, the Wurundjeri people of the Kulin Nation, and recognise their continued connection to land, waters and culture. I know that people are joining from all over and acknowledge the traditional custodians of the lands on which you're all working today, and pay my respects to elders past and present. So today we're very lucky to be joined by Dr. Jodie Grigg, a research associate at the National Drug Research Institute at Curtin University in Perth. Jodie coordinates the WA arm of the Ecstasy and Related Drug Reporting System, a project that she has been involved with since 2010. Her research expertise and passion lies in drugs used in party settings, drug policies and harm reduction. Her PhD on music festivals was recommended for a Chancellor's Commendation and has informed government harm reduction campaigns in WA and recommendations from the 2019 coronial inquest into 6 drug-related deaths at New South Wales music festivals. So this presentation will summarise key findings and recommendations from a large doctoral study on drug use in music festivals, covering topics like drug detection dogs, drug checking, drug amnesty bins, on-site medical services, drug use patterns and practices, reasons for using drugs, and adverse experiences. So we've got a lot in store for this afternoon. After Jodie's presentation, we are also really lucky to be joined by Dr. Monica Barrett, who is a social scientist at the Drug Policy Modelling Program, part of Australia's National Drug and Alcohol Research Centre at the University of New South Wales. And Monica was also one of Jodie's supervisors for the PhD, so is going to have some great and keen insights to discuss. Throughout the presentation, please think of and share as many questions as you can in the Q&A function, not the chat. And I will do my best to get to these once we have seen the presentation. So without any further ado, I'll hand over to Jodie. If you want to turn on your camera and mic, Jodie, and I'll disappear.
Hi everyone, thank you for being here today. I really appreciate you taking the time. I can't actually see any of you, but thank you. So my presentation today is going to cover some key findings from my PhD, which was a mixed method study of drug use at music festivals. So it was actually passed back in May 2020 and has been publicly available online since last May. So throughout the course of the project and since, I've given lots of briefings and presentations on specific topics to stakeholders, but I haven't had many opportunities to give a more comprehensive presentation like this, which is going to be covering a wider range of topics to a much wider audience. So I did want to thank NDARC for the opportunity, and I apologise in advance for trying to fit a lot into this presentation, but it's my hope that if some of this does spark your interest and has relevance in your field, you'll now be aware that the thesis exists online as a resource to access anytime. I was lucky enough to have Simon Lenton and Monica Barrett as my supervisors, so I'd like to acknowledge and thank them upfront for their contribution to the project, and also thank Monica for being here today to join me for the panel discussion. I'd also like to acknowledge the traditional custodians of the land from which I'm speaking today, the Whadjuk Noongar people, and pay my respects to elders past, present and emerging. So I'm going to be starting with some background information and recent developments in the festival space. I'll then outline my research aims and methods very briefly. I'm then going to present a range of key findings across a variety of topics, and then I'll close with a quick discussion of the priority recommendations. So for the thesis, I did a very comprehensive systematic literature review, but today I'm really going to focus on the research findings and instead just give some background context to the study. I'm sure none of this is particularly new to you, given the level of media coverage in recent years, but festivals have become increasingly popular in recent decades, particularly those with a focus on electronic dance music. And since their emergence, they've been identified as popular contexts for drug use. So this is not a new phenomenon. And as at November 2019, when I finished my lit review, I documented 125 drug-related festival deaths, including 16 within Australia in the past 5 years. Unfortunately, I haven't had the opportunity to do a full update since, but I am aware that 2 deaths have actually occurred since February this year. The nature and extent of morbidity is less clear, but case studies have documented a wide array of long-term health consequences, from enduring neuropsychological deficits to limb amputations, although those cases don't really reach the media. It's the deaths that have led to increased concern, but there has been and remains a lot of contention about how best to respond. So while some advocate for more punitive and deterrent approaches, others are obviously arguing for more evidence-based and more progressive approaches. And just having provided this background, which is largely focused on harm, I did want to emphasize that this research wasn't intended to sensationalize or focus on all the negative elements which dominate the literature and debate. Rather, I wanted to take a more balanced look at festivals in order to most effectively respond with the belief that they're an important part of Australian youth culture. And I just wanted to touch on some recent developments. So in 2019, we had the New South Wales Coronial Inquest into 6 deaths, which led to recommendations for a complete drug policy overhaul, including decriminalising small amounts of illicit drugs, trialling pill testing. And when I say pill testing, I'm using that interchangeably with drug checking, ceasing drug operations and unlawful strip searches. And as Daisy mentioned, I did give evidence from the study at the inquest, which helped inform some of these recommendations. However, unfortunately, most of the recommendations have not been supported despite compelling evidence by many experts. But New South Wales did introduce some policing and regulatory changes, albeit pretty contentious ones, as part of the 2019 Festivals Act. Other key developments have included the ACT on-site pill testing trials and fixed site trials, which was extended this year. Queensland has recently announced they'll be introducing pill testing. Drug amnesty bins have been implemented in multiple jurisdictions, although critics claim they're being used to mask the government's refusal to properly respond to the evidence, and they're more of an easy response for politicians to endorse. And some jurisdictions have updated their event guidelines and education efforts. Just in recent weeks, pill testing was also discussed in WA Parliament following concern about the recent deaths this year. And it's my understanding that the outcomes were essentially a reaffirming of a blanket refusal to consider pill testing. And they noted that current solutions include their government safer events campaigns, levers, stakeholder training, and convening interagency groups to consider strategies for optimising safety. So overall, some shifts are occurring, I think particularly around greater public understanding of the benefits of pill testing, but overall punitive approaches remain, and there's been little progressive action in most jurisdictions. And I just wanted to include this slide to show that the dominant message by many politicians continues to be this "don't do drugs," which as a standalone message is getting a little frustrating now. While we all agree that the safest option is obviously not to take drugs, it's not realistic to think that this as a standalone message is going to resonate with people who are already using drugs at festivals. Having said this, there's obviously been a change in government in New South Wales, which may create some policy opportunity windows, and that's going to be interesting to see, given some of the past comments about pill testing by the new Premier. And I just wanted to show a quick 1-minute report to illustrate a recent example of the type of ongoing media debate we've been seeing for close to a decade now in response to drug-related deaths. I'm hoping this works. Daisy, just let me know if it doesn't.
The Transmission Festival had already been deemed a high-risk event. A sweltering 37-degree day only made matters worse. At least a dozen people were hospitalised for suspected drug-related medical issues, and 1 man died. He was 26-year-old Commonwealth Bank employee Kieran No. The fatality has renewed calls to introduce pill testing in New South Wales.
This is about expert evidence. This is about what works. This is about saving lives.
A 2019 inquest into 6 festival deaths found compelling evidence in favour of pill testing. A trial was also one of the recommendations to emerge from the state's recent ICE inquiry. It was rejected. The government is opting for a different approach.
Don't take drugs. So to people across New South Wales, stay safe and don't take drugs.
Just saying no has never worked. It never will. The one objective of a sensible drugs policy must be to save lives.
Again, I think that little snippet just highlights that there's been little budging on this just say no stance for many politicians, despite that message failing to stop harms and accumulating evidence on the benefits of pill testing. And given the festival industry is continuing to expand and deaths continue to occur, there's an ongoing need to consider a more realistic rather than idealistic approach that's informed by evidence. So now we'll move on to the actual study. So the overall aims were to investigate the nature and extent of drug use, including alcohol, associated with festivals, assess policy and practice strategies aimed at reducing the risk of harm, and ultimately develop recommendations aimed at improving strategies. So a pragmatic mixed methods approach was employed, involving 3-stepped phases. Firstly, pre-survey qualitative interviews with 29 key informants and 20 regular festival goers. Phase 2 involved an anonymous online survey with a final sample of almost 2,000 festival goers. And Phase 3 involved post-survey qualitative interviews. And thematic analyses of the qualitative data was used to inform, complement, and interpret analyses of the core data, which was collected from the online survey. And the project was structured around 4 themes. So prevalence, patterns and practices, motives or reasons for using drugs, adverse effects and experiences, and the last theme related to interventions. So now I'm going to take you through the findings from each theme and then take you to the priority recommendations. And the eligibility criteria for the online survey was aged at least 16, resided in WA or Victoria for the past 12 months, and attendance at least one festival in the last 12 months. And I should note that this data was collected in 2016 now, which is a clear limitation to consider as I read through this. And I really do hope to repeat the research sometime very soon. Also, most of the findings presented today are going to pertain to the last festival the participant had attended. So the survey was designed so that we could develop a coherent story of the participant's last festival experience. So on to the findings. The first finding is that 62% of respondents reported using an illicit drug at the last festival they attended. The most commonly reported illicit drug was ecstasy, reported by half the sample, followed by cannabis, reported by about 1/3, ketamine by about 1/10, and then LSD, nitrous oxide, and cocaine. Among respondents who used a drug at their last festival, excluding tobacco, 68% reported using more than one drug, and the median number was 3. Over 300 unique drug combinations were identified. So previous studies hadn't delineated festival-specific polydrug use combinations. So that was a gap in the literature that I wanted to address. While significant diversity in polydrug use was identified, about half reported some combination of ecstasy, alcohol, and/or cannabis. Probably no surprise that alcohol was the most common drug in the mix, with 90% of illicit drug users reporting use. But this represents a bit of a shift from earlier rave culture where alcohol wasn't as prominent, and this adding of alcohol to the mix raises concern given evidence about increased toxicity, unpredictability, and masking effects. And I just wanted to quickly flag this 2021 paper, which concluded that alcohol can have a profound negative impact on MDMA-related hypothermia. Probably not a big surprise, but it is worth noting given it's such a normalized behavior. And key informants also identified polydrug use as one of the most concerning trends. Patterns of use were not homogeneous. So this table is summarizing a series of multivariable analyses, which I'm going to talk you through a little. So as you can see, significant differences were identified between genders, jurisdictions, festival types, musical preferences, and ages. So while no difference was identified between jurisdictions in terms of overall drug use, Victorians were more likely than West Australians to report certain types of drugs, such as ketamine, cocaine and methamphetamine, although there has been shifting trends in terms of ketamine use and cocaine in WA since data collection, so that might not be the case anymore. Meanwhile, West Australians were more likely to report pharmaceutical stimulant use such as dexamphetamine. In terms of gender, with the exception of a small number of drugs, such as pharmaceutical stimulants and benzos, males had higher odds and were at double the odds of using any illicit. Probably unsurprisingly, multi-day festival goers were significantly more likely to report use of most drugs, particularly psychedelics, where they had 13 times greater odds, nitrous oxide 5 times greater odds, and cannabis 3 times greater odds. Multi-day festival goers also had higher overall rates of any illicit drug use, about 3 times the odds. And these findings likely reflect differences in the styles of multi-day festivals. For example, transformational festivals synergize well with psychedelics. They're often in regional locations featuring desirable environmental stimuli. The duration allows greater windows of opportunity, and they're more likely to use drugs to manage cycles of ups and downs across the event. And there's also socio-spatial elements related to campsites where there's more sharing and access to drugs. In terms of age, younger respondents were less likely to report using ecstasy and cocaine and had lower overall rates than over 25s. And lastly, those with a preference for EDM as a genre were more likely to report using illicit drugs except cannabis. So overall, I think it's just useful to be aware of these kinds of differences when planning events and resource allocation, because it's not a one-size-fits-all. Some events might really benefit from certain interventions that would be less useful at other events. And there's a huge diversification in the style of music festivals these days. The study also explored 4 out of the 5 key components of the normalisation thesis as outlined by Parker in 2002 and found strong indications that illicit drug use at festivals was normalised in this sample. For example, almost everyone believed illicit drug use was a normal feature of attending festivals, and there was high perceived availability. Only 2% thought that it would have been very difficult to obtain illicit drugs inside the last festival. And there was a lot of discussion in the thesis about the normalisation data, if this area interests you. But overall, I think this has implications for the festival policy debate. We often hear this argument that drug checking will condone or normalise illicit drug use, but I think that argument is weakened if illicit drug use is already normalised, as suggested here. I also wanted to emphasise that pre- and post-festival activities represent key points in the day. So as you can see in this figure, in relation to one-day festivals, 44% used an illicit drug before even getting there, and over a third used one after leaving. So no contemporary studies at the time had examined pre-post patterns of use, but these rates were much higher than observed in the earlier rave studies, and that may reflect increased preloading practices now in response to heavy drug policing at events. And this is noteworthy because often that earlier drug use in the day can alter the trajectory of the rest of the day. So these are normally the warmer hours, which has implications for hypothermia. It reduces the inhibitions early, which can encourage heavier patterns of use moving forward, and overall may just reflect riskier patterns of use than if people were planning their day without the risk of policing at the gates. And this was just a nice quote from the qualitative data, which illustrated a typical pattern of polydrug use across a day, where it's common for people to focus on stimulant drugs in the day and then depressants after the event. I won't read due to time, but overall, it's just important to consider pre-post activities when targeting interventions. For example, with pill testing, it's not going to be effective on site for those who have already dropped before they've even arrived. And using drugs to manage cycles of ups and downs is also particularly important for multi-day festivals where people are trying to energize themselves in the day, get rest at night, and then repeat. And in my review of deaths, multiple drug toxicity was very common, and there were a variety of different themes that emerged in that review. So if you're interested in learning more about that, I'd suggest checking out the thesis. Another finding I wanted to share related to the quantities of drugs being used. So a median of 3 ecstasy pills was used across a festival day. At multi-day festivals, the amounts consumed daily were similar, but unsurprisingly, total amounts were higher. And interestingly, males and females mostly use comparable amounts of ecstasy. And when looking at pill and cap forms together, 42% use more than 3 and 20% use more than 5. So overall, there were people using pretty large quantities of ecstasy, but of course, we know nothing about the actual purity or dose consumed. And again, this was back in 2016. Risky patterns of drug use were also very common. One concerning finding was half those who used ecstasy reported double dropping at the last festival. So that's simultaneously swallowing 2 pills at the same time. And if you're interested in learning more about that, we published a paper that you can check out. I won't go through all of the risk practices, but as you can see here, about half reported dancing for prolonged periods without taking breaks. 1 in 5 had used illicit drugs and partied the night before. 1 in 5 went 24 hours or longer without sleeping, and 1 in 10 reported using drugs when in a bad mindset. Gender differences were identified. For example, females were more likely to not eat and hydrate properly, whereas males were more likely to double drop and go 24 hours or longer without sleeping. And although risk practices were reported, respondents also reported actively seeking information about drug content and engaging in a variety of other practices they thought would decrease their risk of harm. A median of 6 were reported from this list. For example, 1 in 10 reported using a reagent testing kit, while half those who used ecstasy pills looked on the Pill Reports website. And I think that reagent testing kit percentage would be a lot higher now, given there's been a lot of increased awareness about them. Other noticeable practices included starting with a smaller amount, 26%, taking magnesium for muscle cramps, 10%, and taking 5-HTP in an attempt to mitigate effects of serotonin depletion. Again, gender differences were observed. And some of you might be thinking that several strategies here lack empirical support, like using 5-HTP. And while I agree, this data was still important to collect as it shows enthusiasm for harm reduction and helps identify areas which might need to be targeted with education. And the qualitative data also raised concerns about protective behaviours with questionable efficacy. For example, many thought that risk was almost entirely mitigated by purchasing drugs from trusted sources and or using certain forms of drugs like crystal, which many perceived as being inherently pure compared to pills. The literature review identified hyponatremia or low sodium as a key health risk associated with MDMA use, yet there was no evidence about awareness of water guidelines. So we investigated this and found that only 41% of respondents who had used ecstasy recently were aware of the water guidelines. A quarter underestimated and a quarter overestimated. And alarmingly, 1 in 5 thought they should drink as much water as possible when using ecstasy. So while both under and over hydration are hazardous, the latter obviously raises concern about hyponatremia or water intoxication. And a lot of you might know that there's lots of social media groups with thousands of members dedicated to sharing drug use experiences. And this comment was posted as featured advice by a moderator of a popular Australian group where she explains that it's an old wives' tale that you can drown. So I think it just highlights that the hydration risks are still not common knowledge, even among experienced users in 2023. The study also investigated practices related to obtaining and supplying illicit drugs, and we found a quarter of those who used drugs organised and obtained them inside the festival. The most common reason for this was simply because the opportunity presented itself, which speaks to the level of availability inside festivals, while almost a third did so to avoid the risk of detection before entering. So obviously purchasing on-site raises concern due to the increased risk of purchasing unknown drug contents, less opportunity to do test dosing and for sourcing information. Moreover, half obtained from completely unknown persons. I also wanted to note that younger age was highly predictive of obtaining drugs inside the festival. And a particularly concerning finding was that 1 in 10 females reported carrying drugs internally, and that rose to 23% that reported hiding drugs internally ever at a festival. Clearly, this method poses health risks, and key informants provided anecdotal reports of patrons presenting to emergency departments unable to remove drugs they'd concealed internally, and young females have been reportedly caught hiding up to 400 caps internally. So as I've mentioned in other papers, complications are likely to arise if policing continues that prompts these kinds of extreme measures of concealment. And these are just some qualitative examples illustrating another method of swallowing concealed drugs to purge once safely inside the gates. So some people will kind of hold the drugs in their mouth in a Ziploc bag, for example, and then swallow if police are approaching, whereas others will swallow them before even arriving with the intention that once they're safely inside, they'll purge them. Moving on, almost 1 in 5 reported supplying illicit drugs in some form at the last festival. However, this could best be described as social supply. For example, most reported doing so just to help out their friends, and 9% only were supplying for profit. So most people, 88%, were supplying to people they knew. Nevertheless, these findings raised concern about social suppliers putting themselves at risk of more serious supply charges when they think they're only helping their friends, suggesting there might need to be some education about how that kind of low-level supply is dealt with in law. Moving on to motives. So with the exception of a few drugs which had quite specific functions like benzos for helping people sleep, the most common reason for using illicit drugs was for fun. You might wonder why I'm including this. It seems pretty simple, but I felt it's important because the positive elements are largely ignored in the debate, and there's very little recognition ever that illicit drug use can be fun. And this is one of the reasons why those stay safe, don't do drugs messages just don't work for people who already use drugs at festivals, because it doesn't resonate with their lived experiences, which for them in these settings may be very positive, as I'll demonstrate further shortly. And this is just a breakdown of motives for ecstasy. And you might have just noticed in that slide that we looked at some novel festival-specific motivations and found that almost half of all ecstasy users reported that the cost of alcohol at festivals was a reason for using ecstasy, while about 1 in 5 nominated avoiding queues for alcohol in toilets. And I'll go into that a little more with the qualitative data, but I should just note that lowering alcohol prices wouldn't necessarily lower the desire to use ecstasy due to the numerous other motives reported. However, the issue around queues for water and other facilities should be addressed because it can discourage proper hydration and increase risks of things like hypothermia. So the qualitative accounts really help to illuminate how illicit drugs were perceived to deeply enhance the overall experience by helping festival goers relax and be more present, more energized, less inhibited, and more connected and sociable with those around them. So new friendships were reportedly formed, existing friendships were strengthened, and these connections were said to persist beyond the festival, and were therefore seen as having a long-term positive effect on their social well-being. So basically, drug use at festivals was commonly viewed as these really valuable bonding experiences. And here were just some qualitative examples to break down the motive of fun a bit more. But for time, I'm just going to skip over. But I just think it's really important that we don't overlook this fundamental reason why people use drugs, as it's likely to be at the detriment of harm reduction efforts. The qualitative data also revealed a strong preference for MDMA over alcohol in festival settings, where the drug was perceived as better suited due to convenience and effects. For example, people explained how it was easier for them to drop a pill than to line up for drinks all day. It was often considered cheaper, and the effects led to a better sensory and social experience than when drinking alcohol as their main drug. So ecstasy was sometimes described as having the positives that they were seeking in alcohol, but without the same drawbacks. So participants explained how they felt uninhibited, but still remained in control and could remember the experience the next day. Again, I've included some experts, but given time, I'll skip over these. But they just illustrate how ecstasy is viewed as more sociable and bonding. And that was a sentiment that was echoed quite a bit by security informants, who said that ecstasy can create a much happier and more manageable environment than settings where there was much higher binge drinking as the focus. Moving on to adverse effects. So respondents were asked to describe the severity of negative effects on a 5-point scale at the last festival they attended, and 3% reported moderate adverse effects, while 1% reported severe. And this figure just shows the breakdown of responses. So as you can see, the most common response experienced was positive effects only, although about a quarter reported illicit drug use with unexpected effects that wasn't necessarily bad, and a quarter experienced mild adverse effects. However, for the vast majority, when we looked at positives compared to negatives, the positives outweighed them. However, this study did capture a range of higher frequency but less severe adverse effects experienced by festival goers, which could potentially develop into more pronounced problems over time. So while the first priority of education efforts should be on raising awareness of those higher risk acute conditions like hypothermia and symptoms which merit medical assessment, these higher frequency effects should perhaps be considered as a secondary priority for education. So here we have the breakdown of adverse physical effects specific to ecstasy. Most commonly was jaw clenching, teeth grinding, while about a quarter reported sleeping problems and irregular heart rate. So again, while these might not have been severe, there is some potential for them to develop into more pronounced health problems over time if someone was attending a lot of events or clubbing a lot and using drugs as well. Again, won't read due to time, but this first quote just illustrates how come downs aren't always these obvious depressive episodes as depicted in some government campaigns. But mental health effects can be more subtle and creep into people's lives without them necessarily realizing why, which highlights the need for education around the effects of MDMA and around taking breaks between use and self-care routines. Okay, moving on to the fourth and final theme, which relates to interventions. So 1 in 4 reported that they would have felt uncomfortable accessing on-site medical services for a problem related to their illicit drug use at the last festival. The most common barriers were fear of legal issues, negative treatment, parents being contacted, and others seeing, or just embarrassment. So regarding the latter, there has been at least one instance where a young man was bullied by his friends out of the medical line and later died. So that kind of hardened attitude really can be an issue. And in the qualitative interviews, several participants expressed strong negative perceptions towards medical tents in terms of the level of competency and care for patients. Many also reasoned with themselves that they could self-manage their problems, and others reported that they were just too high to seek help or even recognize that they needed help. So overall, it was clear that barriers need to be addressed from multiple different angles, including perceptions of the medical services and help seeking, the way the services themselves operate, and awareness of red flag symptoms among individuals and social networks. We asked a variety of questions about pill testing, and 80% of participants who used illicit drugs said they would have accessed drug checking at the last festival had it been available to them. Among those who wouldn't, the main barriers identified included fear of police watching them, which was reported by half, but about a third also reported that they trusted their supplier, so they didn't think it was necessary, and others had already tried drugs from that batch. So that goes back to what I was saying previously about people seeming to place a lot of faith in their suppliers. And about a fifth were concerned about others seeing, and some were just concerned about missing the actual festival. Importantly, 3/4 said they would not have consumed their drugs if advised they contained something dangerous. This just shows the breakdown. So while a quarter said they may have still consumed their drugs, Most of these people also reported that they would at least be more cautious, use less of the substance, and or research the substance. Other key findings were that over half would also warn their friends, a third would inform the supplier, and that younger people were at greater odds of using despite being advised of the risks, which I think is a concern. Somewhat unsurprising, but substantial minorities would only access on or off-site drug checking services. So while most would consider both, 20% would only consider on-site, while 14% would only consider off-site. And the qualitative data revealed that some were concerned about being seen attending the service and then being identified as a drug user, and that possibly getting back to family, so that they would prefer a more private off-site location. Off-site also had other advantages, like engaging people while sober, the opportunity for them to replace drugs that tested unfavorably, and not disrupting their festival day and causing them to miss acts, which is particularly relevant for one-day festivals where there's limited time and people have paid a lot of money to attend. Other key findings were that 39% would only access the service if it was free, and younger age was associated with significantly lower odds of willingness to pay. These findings on drug dogs have been published in papers, so probably won't come as a surprise. But overall, the expectation of this policing strategy did not deter the vast majority of festival goers from using illicit drugs at the last festival. Rather, the threat of dogs resulted in responses which may inadvertently increase risks. The most common responses were concealing their drugs well, including internally, getting someone else to carry their drugs, buying their drugs inside the festival, taking less easily detected drugs. So some people reported switching from drugs like cannabis to a synthetic, and taking drugs before entering. Only 4% reported making the decision not to use drugs. Also, 10% of those with drugs on their person when sighting dogs reported consuming drugs at the last festival, and that rose to 17% when we asked people who had ever used an illicit drug at a festival if they'd ever concealed their drugs internally. And no respondents were detected with drugs due to a positive identification. And for a full breakdown on those findings, you can refer to this paper from 2018. So on to the last finding of the day. So less than a quarter said they would have discarded their drugs into a bin had they been concerned about detection at the last festival. And again, there's a paper on this topic for those interested in looking into this one a bit more. And the most commonly reported barriers were not wanting to waste their money, having less fun by not having illicit drugs, and concern about police watching and ultimately pursuing them afterwards. So overall, the data suggested that drug amnesty bins had pretty limited efficacy in preventing panic consumption due to policing at the gates. So finally, what were the priority recommendations, and have any of them actually happened since submitting this thesis in 2020? I apologise for these slides, which are a bit hectic. So there are 7 priority recommendations, which I'm going to skim through today, keeping in mind that I haven't covered everything which informed these. So recommendation 1 was to expand and evaluate drug checking trials. So there has been progress, obviously in the ACT in Queensland, hence why there's a tick, although only in 2 jurisdictions, why there's a cross as well. So I think there is a need for further expansion of trials drawing on the available evidence. Recommendation 2 was to urgently cease the use of drug detection dogs. There hasn't been progress here that I'm aware of, with the exception of implementing drug amnesty bins. But I reiterate the need to cease use, given it is a clear catalyst for panic linked to deaths, and also used to justify strip searches, which have been found can potentially lead to some long-term mental health effects for young people comparable to sexual assaults. Recommendation 3 was to remove barriers to seeking medical attention. And as previously noted, there's various different ways or angles to tackle this from. Recommendation 4 was to shift from a zero tolerance policy to a harm reduction policy. This is a little bit of a tricky one, as it potentially requires more macro level changes in order for organisers to be able to promote that kind of policy. Recommendation 5 was to create more enabling environments for harm reduction. And this recommendation was drawing on risk and enabling an environment theory and assemblage thinking. So while there have been updates to event guidelines, I'm not aware of any utilisation of these types of frameworks or ways of thinking in event planning. So I think that's definitely worth considering, and the thesis contains a breakdown of those different theories and how they might be applied in festival planning. Recommendation 5 was to improve sector collaboration with holistic event planning. So interagency working groups have and are still being established to stop sectors working in silos. But again, I think more can be done to get everyone, including law enforcement, working towards the same objective of keeping young people safe with an overarching policy of harm reduction rather than zero tolerance. And holistic planning frameworks could be drawn on here. Recommendation 6 was to improve drug education and methods of delivery. And speaking from WA, I think there has been some progress. For example, the Mental Health Commission has drawn on evidence from the study to inform campaigns, and I really applaud those in the Drug Aware team who are always striving to make campaigns as evidence-based as possible. However, I think there's always room for improvement with different types of resources, messaging and campaign styles, and ongoing consideration of how best to utilise emerging technologies and adapt to emerging trends and evidence. And the final priority recommendation was to review medical responses at festivals and systematically document patient records and deaths. I concede that I'm not entirely sure where each jurisdiction is now in terms of mandating higher levels of care models for higher risk events. I think it is occurring in some states, but I think more could be done to improve prediction ability and planning. So I did in my lit review, I did a review of the mass gathering medicine literature and identified some clear limitations with the available data, evidence gaps and ways forward. And I think we need to establish some minimum data sets to inform national databases and systematically document adverse events, better resource medical, and establish clearer protocols for identifying and managing higher risk conditions like hypothermia earlier on to improve public health outcomes. And I again want to emphasize that we do have to be careful to avoid placing unreasonable demands on organisers that would render events financially unfeasible, as this may push the scene underground and essentially increase risk. So there's things to think about there, and one option is redirecting resources, for example, from policing into medical. And the extended recommendations are in my thesis, so I encourage you to check those out if you do work in this space and want to delve into this further. So thank you so much for listening, and I welcome any questions now and beyond today also.
That's wonderful. Thank you so much, Jodie. Do you want to stop sharing your screen? And then Monica, do you want to share that? Yeah, turn your camera on. Wonderful. Thank you. Thank you so much, Jodie. That was such a comprehensive presentation, such a broad body of work. It's incredibly impressive. And obviously that shows in the ways that you've been able to engage since your PhD. So yeah, first off, huge round of applause. Thank you. And yes, a small representation of the huge round of applause from Monica. Thank you. And to start off, I guess I'd just like to hand over to Monica and ask for some initial thoughts. Obviously, you've been working with Jodie on this body of work for a long time. So yeah, what's your take? is Monica frozen for everyone? No, here you are.
I've come back.
Okay, great.
Yeah, thank you so much, Jodie. Is my internet okay now?
Yeah.
Yes. Look, it's been such a comprehensive journey, and again, I just want to congratulate you on leading this journey over the 5 or 6 years that we were doing this together. I think there's some really powerful recommendations that you've made here. Many of them match the recommendations that have been made in numerous inquiries, some of which you've contributed evidence to. For example, the New South Wales inquiry in 2019, subsequent coronial inquests in Victoria that have recommended drug checking, better early warning systems, etc. But I think also your data is such a strong illustration of the inadequacy of the punitive policing response that we currently live under in terms of these settings for people who use drugs in most parts of Australia. It's not only inadequate, as you show, people continue to use drugs, hardly anyone is deterred from using drugs. It's more than that, it's actually causing significant harm. People are going to all kinds of lengths to do things that can harm them, internal concealment, having to purchase substances inside the venue from people they do not know, not having access to a service that could test those drugs for them, and therefore being at greater risk. So look, I mean, I may be preaching to the converted here at our audience, I'm not sure, but these things to me are really solid findings, and being able to point to your evidence has been incredibly helpful for me and for others advocating in this field. So yeah, I just wanted to sum it up in that way.
A great summary. Thank you, Monica. To start off with, so yeah, please, we've got about 10 minutes for questions, so do pop them in the Q&A. To start off with, the applause is being heard all around, Jodie. There are some congratulations and thank yous. And yeah, really useful and great research, so congratulations. I guess I will, and yes, yeah, also just some nice comments here about the work that peer organisations are doing currently. An important shout out to Dancewise ACON at specific events, but in general for the work that they do. I will start off with my question, because I have the floor, and that is my prerogative. So Jodie and Monica, one of the challenges that is faced often when considering an intervention like drug checking or pill testing is that both sides of the argument are generally invested in reducing harmful outcomes like overdose or death, but the difference lies in how this might be achieved. And as you highlighted in the background, for those who oppose, it's generally an abstinence focus. And the argument that we hear from those who oppose drug checking is that we know that people have died from pure MDMA, and such an intervention may just give them a green light to use or a false sense of security. How do you respond to that kind of argument, Jodie, and what's your take on that?
Yeah, thanks, Daisy. I'm glad that was asked, because I think there's this really common misconception that people are simply told, yes, this contains MDMA, go for it, have fun. But people are never told that the substance is safe. All drugs, even pure MDMA, carries risks, and that's why there is the brief intervention or educational component, which is just as important as testing the drugs. So the services obviously provide an opportunity for young people to engage with health experts who wouldn't otherwise have that opportunity, where they're informed about the test results and the limitations of those test results, and given critical information about the risks. So if MDMA was detected, I expect they'd be advised that even MDMA at normal doses can be risky in the wrong conditions, particularly in kind of warm festival environments. So they'd be learning about the risks of hypothermia, hyponatremia, proper hydration, and how to identify those red flag symptoms. So I think it encourages them to be more cautious, not less cautious. and it makes people more likely to seek help. And I think early intervention is really critical for improving health outcomes. Ideally, services would be able to provide information on dosage, given there have been very high purity MDMA pills circulating in recent years. Obviously, again, noting limitations that there's fluctuations within batches. I'm not the expert on where the technology is with the ability to test for dosage as well, but I know Monica's done more work in that space, so I might hand over to Monica to talk a bit more about that.
Sure, thanks, Jodie. And yeah, I agree with your response. Definitely, drug checking services can and do test for dosage and purity. I'm certainly not running the CanTest service, but I do understand that MDMA is one of 10 target drugs where they are able to, in the laboratory on-site, it's an off-site service, so it's not at a festival, but they're able to provide that dosage information so people can decide if they have a stronger pill or a stronger powder that they can dose more effectively. And so, like Jodie said, someone can have a discussion about appropriate dosing. And this is something a lot of people don't know. They might not know how many milligrams is too much of a dose. And we saw that at the inquest to the deaths in 2018-19 in New South Wales, where, you know, there were some individuals reportedly had taken 9-10 capsules in one day. It was an astoundingly high dose. And so the dosage education that a drug checking service can provide is really critical.
Yeah, great. Thanks both. We've got loads of questions coming in. As anticipated, Jodie, there's lots of interest in this area. So one comment and question from Caroline Salem starts off, really nice work, Jodie. Thanks for sharing. It'll be really interesting to see how some of these are implemented as the sector moves forward. The information sharing space will be really interesting to watch with the emergence of the prompt response network. Any thoughts that you'd like to share on that?
Yeah, obviously the work of the prompt response network is amazing. I know they're still in kind of phases of setting up all those systems, and I know in Western Australia, at least, where we've got working groups where we're feeding this kind of information into those groups. Not a huge amount to say besides it's really exciting to see where that's going to go, and that we're aware of it and doing what we can to feed evidence into that.
Yeah, I've just come back from Harm Reduction 23, and yesterday Penny Hill and Brendan, who's taking over the Prompt Response Network, did a nice little summary of what's going on. And yeah, so the KNOW network, as it's now called, has a web portal, and that's available for people in the sector, but they're also looking to very much expand the sharing of peer-driven information, because we know that so many of these trends come first from our peer networks. They're often really the first people to notice that something odd is going on with the drug supply. So it's really important to try and respect that knowledge, harness that knowledge to help work out what to do with drug alerts. So that system is super exciting as well, and drug checking can feed into that system.
Yeah, it's definitely an exciting and expanding space. So looking forward to seeing what's next. Jodie, questions, they just keep coming. We've probably got time for two more. So yeah, comments here on things that are important to flag. The insurance premiums to conduct pill testing on site at festivals has made it unviable to do so in some cases. Cost is also a factor when looking at testing for dosage or purity, as you mentioned. Any thoughts on this? Monica, I'll pass that one to you.
Sure. So my understanding is that inexplicably insurance companies have increased by many many times the amount that they're wanting to take for insurance for public liability, etc., for a festival-based service. But it's more feasible in terms of insurance to do a fixed site service, which is not at a festival. And I mean, Jodie's recommendations were that we need both. And you can see from her data, there are certain people who would not be served well by an off-site service, but equally there are some people who would not be able to access an on-site festival service. That, so if in terms of equity, it's really important that we do have a fixed site service that's accessible not only to people who have paid many hundreds of dollars in some cases to attend a festival. But yeah, so the insurance issue is very live. However, in the context of, governments changing their policy, once a government changes its policy and directs someone to do this work, they can underwrite insurance. Governments are more powerful than this. So, I think this issue can be resolved through political intervention, and we certainly shouldn't make it, we're at this crossroads right now, but I think it can be moved through for sure.
Yeah. Kind of to that point, we've got a lot of questions here about the fact that you're presenting some compelling evidence here, Jodie, and we're seeing it in a lot of different places, but there is still political ill will. Simon summarized it very well in this question, which I'll read out, but we've had it kind of across the Q&A. We have a new government in New South Wales, as Jodie has said, that can provide a window of opportunity for new considerations of policy and practice change. Have local stakeholders been reaching out to new ministers and advisors re evidence-based interventions such as drug checking in the lead up and post-election period? Other people asking questions about how to advocate or agitate for change, who to reach out to. Jodie, I'll ask you first for your thoughts, and Monica, if you have thoughts as well.
So is the question whether I'm aware of people reaching out?
Yeah.
I'm not aware at this point. I think it's a very recent development.
Yeah.
I'm just wrapping my head around the change and what potentially could happen, like going back and seeing what's been said, but I'm not aware of what's happening in that space, but I'm always open to chatting with people that are intending to go down that path and look into it further if they have any questions about the research.
Yeah.
So on Sunday at the opening of the Harm Reduction 23 conference, we had Rose Jackson, Minister for Homelessness, Housing, Youth, and apparently also Drugs and Alcohol, giving a rousing address about how everything was wrong with drug policy in New South Wales and how she wanted to fix it all, and they were going to have a drug summit and they're going to fix everything. And she mentioned drug checking, she mentioned the punitive responses and the problems with them. So I think she's definitely in a phase of collecting information, being willing to look at things. Who knows whether those words will turn into action, but I think if you want to email Rose Jackson, anyone out there, and even Jodie, just say, hey, I'm available if you're reviewing your drug policy. I'd love to contribute some evidence. I think she'd be open to that. So it's exciting times for New South Wales.
Yeah, definitely. We're going to have to wrap up. I think that it's a great note to end on. With your local MPs, you can contact anyone to agitate for the changes that you'd like to see. But just to finish up, Jodie, thank you so much. It was such an excellent presentation and such a massive achievement in terms of your PhD and the impact that's already being felt, and looking forward to seeing greater impact ongoing from that research. And thank you again, Monica, for joining us. It was such a benefit to have you on the panel. And just before you leave us, I will ask Morgane to share the screen with the upcoming webinars from NDARC in the next few weeks. So on the 4th of May, we've got Current Trends in Overdose and Other Drug-Induced Deaths in Australia, presented by our very own Associate Professor Amy Peacock. The week after that, another cracker, Vaccine Uptake Amongst People Who Inject Drugs, the Pandemic and Beyond, from Olivia Price. And then the minimum unit price of alcohol in the Northern Territory from Dr. Nicholas Taylor, also from the National Drug Research Institute at Curtin. So thank you all so much for joining us. I hope you have a lovely afternoon. And thanks again, Jodie and Monica, for such a great presentation and discussion.
Thank you, Daisy.
Thank
Excellent.
you. Thanks, everyone.